I'm Terrence. I'm the family pastor at First Chinese Baptist Church of Walnut, and I'm here with Enoch, who will introduce himself in a moment. But we're here to talk about this topic of, are monoethnic churches like ours, are they diverse, and what diversity is. So why don't you introduce yourself, Enoch?
Thanks, Terrence. I'm Enoch. I'm a pastor in Boston. I've been there since 2001, and I hear that question a lot. The question of, are predominantly Asian churches diverse? So we were talking earlier about kind of how to maybe frame it up, and one question that I come across a lot is, let's say we're pastors and we're talking, and there's this new church plant, and it's maybe a year or two old. And just in the church world, if someone says, hey, that church down the street, I checked it out, I visited there, I worshiped there, it's really diverse.
Yeah.
What do you think people instantly think of when they hear, that's a diverse church? Well, I mean, your experience, what have you found?
Well, I mean, right when I hear that, I'm thinking that they're not thinking of my church on the surface, right? They're thinking, oh, you guys all look the same, so you guys aren't diverse. So to answer your question, it's that there's a variety of ethnicities and maybe how people look and so on and so forth. That's diversity.
Yeah, that's totally my experience, especially in a place like Boston, which, like a lot of other urban centers around the country, has been kind of a, it's a good thing that a lot of churches are being planted there and they're aiming to be diverse. I would say in almost every context, when someone says that's a really diverse nonprofit or that's a really diverse, workforce or something, they almost always mean race and ethnicity.
Yeah.
Well, in Boston, they'll also mean other things like sexual orientation and gender identity and stuff like that. But in the evangelical world, it's a little bit more like ethnicity. So I guess we're just not diverse.
I guess not. But let me ask you this, Enoch. I mean, how would you define diversity?
Yeah. So I think the notion that diversity is mostly race, because that's where people are starting from, might reflect that how in the States right now, and kind of the world, we are highly racialized, in the sense we're really thinking about race. When I think about race, or diversity I should say, and I think the context that we use is, what are some of the barriers or differences that have made it harder to get along or understand each other? And in the context of church ministry or local ministry, what are the differences that can be barriers to gospel ministry? Whether it's just proclaiming the gospel, communicating the gospel, working together alongside in teams. And so that's sort of my go-to thing. It might not match the diversity definition in like Black studies or Asian American studies, although there's some connection there. But that's the main thing. Like, what is a difference that you and I have that I may not even realize is a difference, but makes it a little more challenging for us to work together? What have you found, or how do you think about diversity?
I hear what you're saying. I mean, in Chinese churches where we are pastoring, when you talk about diversity, it is all over the place. We are in different language congregations. There's different generations. There's different generations by which they immigrated to the United States and have settled down. And even then, don't get started about Taiwan versus China versus Hong Kong. And in my church, there's a large presence of Indonesians as well in the English congregation. So diversity is every single week for us.
Yeah, so you're highlighting things that I can totally relate to. And I think those in immigrant heritage churches also kind of relate to. So if I were to pick up on that and build on that, when I think about the book of Acts, and a little bit of the New Testament, Old Testament as well, and this is not a super deep theological thing, I think this is almost like probably fairly plain, almost a simplistic observation. When I look through Acts in the Bible, I think of what were some of those differences that hindered gospel ministry. So you talked about some. You talked about, don't even get me started on Taiwan, Hong Kong. We have Tibetan Chinese in our church. So the fact you're all the same, it's like, I would call that political or national diversity. And in the Bible, it was a zealot as a disciple or a tax collector as a disciple. It's radically different political views. You also talked about different generations. There was a group of people that blocked children from meeting Jesus. These horrible people were the disciples. I mean, horrible in tongue in cheek. It's like these are Christians or Christ followers that are trying to really follow their rabbi, and yet in their admittedly misguidedness, that probably I would do if I was there too, they hindered the younger. So there's definitely a lot of teaching in the Bible, old and new, about like kind of younger appreciating the old. Gray is the crown, upon the glory and wisdom, and don't look down upon you because you're young. So I do think generational diversity is a big thing. You mentioned, talk about languages. How many languages are in your local church in terms of actual ministries or worship services?
I mean, officially 3 languages.
Officially 3. Okay, I'm waiting for the unofficial number.
Unofficial, there's many more. Dialects, geographical regions,
Right.
how they speak and how they understand each other. There's a variety for sure.
Okay, so what is that? English,
Yeah.
Mandarin and Cantonese?
Yes.
And what else do you kind of have there? Like other heart languages?
Oh yeah, we have Indonesian. That's a strong one.
yeah.
There's definitely a group of Taiwanese speakers
Yep.
in our church.
Yep.
Yeah, there's quite a few.
Yeah, so in the Bible, I always get a kick out of that because I don't know people's theology, but there's a Holy Spirit gift to deal with that. Our church's business meetings are trilingual. So people talk about a diverse thing. You want a diverse meeting, try it this. Our meeting begins like this. Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. Mandarin interpretation. Cantonese interpretation. I'd like you to turn to page 4 to look at the budget. And then that just work. Yeah, I would love the gift of tongues so I could, so we don't need that interpretation. But language diversity is huge. Interestingly, that's probably one of the only diversities that I'll call majority or white evangelicalism acknowledges to the point where, okay, yeah, you need to do another service. But beyond that, you really should be together. And yeah, so language diversity, gender diversity, Jew, Gentile, cultural diversity. Oh, that's a big one. Like people look at your church and say, oh, you're all the same, right? But the American-born locals, the local-born, and the overseas-born, it's
Night and day.
yeah, it's pretty different. It's pretty different, right?
Yeah.
I remember, and we've probably talked about this before. I've read commentaries in Acts, chapters 5 and 6 particularly, and I've read commentaries where those first major church conflict was a conflict between Jews and Greeks. And I know you know this part in Acts with the first deacons, and I remember reading this commentary of a really respected commentary that I appreciate and have learned a lot from, but I thought, really? I don't think they were Jews and Greeks. They were Hellenic Jews.
Yep.
And sort of Jews who are sort of from the Jerusalem area. So you got local-born Jews, and can I call them overseas-born Jews or
That's
OBJs?
That's right.
And so the first conflict of the church that almost had a church split by which God providentially installed deacons was an intra-ethnic conflict, Jews and Jews over cultural differences. And I just think people might not appreciate how stark those differences are and how challenging they are. So there's a few more, but we probably got most of them. The biggest. I think there's one more big diversity thing. It's harder to find in most churches, and especially in suburbs. You might have it as well, especially if you've got a lot of immigrants. But our church, I think one of the hardest barriers is socioeconomic diversity. Or to put it in another term, a little bit more contemporary, class diversity. And I know that's kind of a contentious term. But rich and poor is in the Bible. I mean, I feel like that's hard. It seems that the only people that can make it on the board are business leaders and PhDs.
Right.
And you cook and wash dishes in a restaurant, you probably, and they think this, our restaurant workers, they don't think they've got the chops or the skills, and they're just blue collar workers. So, but I actually think, in my limited experience, that class, social economic thing is probably the hardest barrier. I don't know if your church has as many rich and poor, because Walnut's kind of a nice area, I think, but I'm sure if you have immigrants, you got all sorts of socioeconomic.
And I think that's the point. It's more than what you can see on the surface.
Yeah.
People might look the same or even gather in the same spaces, but that doesn't mean that everyone is the same.
Yeah. So we just went over what I like to think of as a diversity of diversities. And so in the book of Acts, you also do have ethnic diversity, cultural diversity. But I like to think of it this way. We're both Chinese, and we both went to UCLA, so that's also part of our ethnicity. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. No need for diversity.
No need for diversity there.
Yeah.
But if I were to grow up in LA, which I did, I've got a lot of Korean American friends. But if you were to go to my ancestral village in China, which I don't even know the name, I can't pronounce it, and go find someone there who's basically my sort of ancestral, Chinese like me, same village like me, put us next to each other, I would have way more in common with my Korean American friend growing up in Southern California, who we don't speak the same languages and we eat completely different foods at home, but we're still growing up in America, listening to the same music, buying the same clothes, drinking the same sort of bubble tea or coffee. And yeah, I think the evangelical church and American white church, it's like we tend to focus almost exclusively on the racial diversity, which is important and a big deal. But I do think that is one of the ways that our church can be incredibly diverse. So I'm going to tell some stories that might get me in trouble, so don't tell me one of these stories. Please.
All right.
Talking to a church planner friend of mine in a denomination that I won't mention here, but it might be from the South. Anyway, so, we're talking, we're friends, and he just made this comment, very innocent, very casual. Well, Enoch, we reach everybody, our church, but you only reach Chinese people. And, he's a good friend, and he can take it, and I can take it. But so I said, let's see where this goes. I said, you reach everybody? Oh, he's like, well, yeah, okay. How many languages does your church worship in? And he looked at me a little funny. He's like, well, one.
Right.
I see. What day and time does your church worship in? He's like, Sunday morning. I said, oh, I don't know many restaurant workers or hotel hospitality cleaners that be able to worship Sunday morning.
Yeah.
In English. Mm-hmm. And I looked at him, and he's like, well, we're an American church. You're a Chinese church. And this is not a flex.
Right.
But I said, I think my church has 5 times the number of American citizens who can vote in our elections than your church. Mm-hmm. And I looked at him and I said, do you mean you have a white church?
Yeah.
And he looked at me. He says, all right, I get it. So, and we talked about how his church is a parish-based. He reaches everybody. Mm-hmm. I thought, well, there's a bunch of hidden adjectives there.
Yeah.
I would say in most American churches, when they say I reach everyone in my parish, there's a couple hidden adjectives. Here they are. Here's what I think. You reach everyone in not a parish, but a geographic-based parish. Mm-hmm. And in this country, geography is almost always aligned with social, economic, and linguistic. Mm-hmm. So because if I reach everyone in my nice suburb, they're all speaking English enough and they all have enough money to live in that suburb. And that's not a critique, that's just the reality.
Right.
Or some scholars call the big sort or things like that. So like a lot of majority culture, they have assumed we reach people in our geographic and socioeconomic parish. For immigrants, though, we also reach people in our parish, but we have some adjectives too. In my experience, I'd love to hear your thoughts, that we reach people from an ethno-linguistic and cultural parish. Mm-hmm. So we're reaching people that need a certain language, or trying to evangelize a certain culture or economic thing. And in doing so, they might drive further to get to that one church, but it's still a parish. It's just not geographic. The only geographic parishes of immigrant churches are actually ethnic enclaves, and they're usually poor. Mm-hmm. That's the Chinatowns, where you can't speak English and you can't buy groceries or services. You need that language access there. So yeah, just don't tell my friend about that story because I don't want to get him in trouble. But basically, it is like fascinating how, at one point we had the conversation and we figured to get theological, the point is raised. Is it even biblical? Are we really achieving the Revelation 7 vision of all the, we were talking about, like, I appreciate what you were saying, like, is it even biblical to have a monoethnic, all homogeneous church like yours? Like, how have you responded, or have you thought about it when people talk to you or ask you about that?
Going back to what you said to start, the idea of diversity relates not so much more related to how we look, but the fact that you have to build bridges to cross different groups of people because of their diversity. So if you see it that way, in our churches, there's definitely an abundance of diversity. Yeah. So the question would be, well, if we need to build bridges, then are we doing what we need to do to reach the people that God has given us the opportunity to reach? Because the churches aren't just about what we prefer to see or what we think should look a certain way from the outside.
Not for us, right?
Yeah, but ultimately, God is building a church. Christ has died for a church, and he is the one that will bring it to completion. And I don't know that any of our churches is responsible for the fullness of Revelation 5 or 7.
Okay. So what if someone were to say, is it even biblical? Are we being biblical? How would you kind of respond to, like, maybe an earnest theological question like that? Not to put you on the spot.
Oh, not at all. I think that's where pastorally we got to reflect. Is ministry so simple in that we never have to cross barriers, humble ourselves, and come up with ways for the sake of shepherding, evangelizing, discipling the people in our churches that everything is just smooth and no bridges need to
Right,
be built,
right.
and we are just all exactly the same. And I think you don't have to work that long in a church like ours to realize that, you know what, we actually exist on the need to build bridges, to connect generations, to be able to allow cultures to communicate to each other,
Right.
not just at each other. And
It's good.
submitting ourselves not just to our own preferences, but to ultimately what is good for the entire church.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think diversity is built in, even if it might not be visible on the outside.
Yeah. And I think to pick up that point, there are bridges that we have to work hard to build that may not be obvious to those that maybe are from the majority culture or don't have, cross-cultural interaction. So there's a difference. One time a missions worker was telling me the difference, he would say, between cross-cultural and bicultural. Like cross-cultural is I'm from a monocultural context and my upbringing, and I have the cross-culture to work. But he looked at our church, he goes, you are bicultural. You actually are native to multiple cultures as well as the blend of those cultures. And so the building of the bridge, and this is important particularly for like some of our Asian American churches. I definitely hear it in the Korean American church when they say this, and Chinese as well, but we just kind of keep it to ourselves. But like, I think sometimes Asian American churches and leaders and pastors beat ourselves up like this. Man, look at that church down the street. They are so diverse. They've got hundreds of people, and they're so different.
Right.
They're all these different races. But like New England, my Korean Heritage Church of like 70 people, we're just 70 people, and we're all Korean, and we can't get along. And honestly, kind of beat themselves up for that. We have more conflict. And then here's what I find. If we have that kind of conflict, we have to blame someone. We blame the Koreanness. We blame the Chinese-ness of it. And I appreciate and resonate with that. I think Korean American leaders and Chinese American leaders express those same frustrations, but a little differently. But here's my take. That 500-600 person on the street may be ethnically diverse, but they're 500 basically college students. And that's not a critique, but they're college students, they're diverse, but they listen to the same music, eat the same food, have the same kind of clothing and talking and stuff like that. It's basically the same generation. Or to call it, they would be a mono-generational, mono-social economic, monolinguistic, group of people. And though they look more diverse, they have probably a lot more in common. Imagine picking a song for like a couple hundred people that are basically 18 to 24.
Right.
Now my Korean Heritage Church friend. In that 70-person Korean Heritage Church, you've got sort of the adults that are our peers. They've got their first-gen Korean parents who are from Korea, who don't speak much English, who, not to pander stereotypes, literally own laundromats. And they only speak Korean. And they've got their children. Oh, so they're like doctors and lawyers, and they've, by God's grace, they work hard to become middle class, and they've moved up the economic ladder, and their kids are growing up. And Korean has a phonetic language. My son learned Korean, and we're walking by, and he reads Korean because he learned it on Duolingo, just because it's phonetic. He can read Korean better than Chinese. But the point is, those kids are going to grow up fully Americanized, And in that 170-person church, they have one worship service.
Right.
So imagine picking a sermon illustration to relate to the 9-year-old kid, the 38-year-old parents, and the 7-year-old parents. Imagine picking a worship song or having a business meeting. That 70-person Korean Heritage Church with immigrants, in my view, I think there's more diversity there than that 500-person or 2,000-person church. And I'll quote sort of someone that Tim Keller was at Gordon Conwell, and someone asked him about Redeemer. This is probably about 10, 15 years ago. And he said, you can find the recording somewhere, he's like, Redeemer, monolithic. And everyone was like, what? We aspire to be Redeemer. Like, are you kidding me? I think it was like 3,000 people at the time. It's interestingly, he also said we had the largest Asian American congregation at the time because there were about and I could be getting, memory and history might be affecting my numbers, but broadly speaking, 3,000-ish people, about half were Asian American. So, and Tim Keller wasn't like boasting or flexing. He's just being very observant. So 1,500 Asian Americans in his church at the time. And I go, oh yeah, that might be Asian American, in terms of immigrant church, right? And he said, they're monolithic. And someone raised their hand in the audience at Gordon Conwell, said, what do you mean? He's like, well, they're all young Manhattanites that eat, dress, walk, and talk the same.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of I thought it was striking.
Yeah.
And so the diversity question is not just a theological one
Right.
that we have to wrestle with and struggle with, but it's also an existential one. And it's also a personal one as leaders. So I just feel like a lot of times Asian Americans can sometimes blame ourselves, be hard on ourselves for conflict and getting along when there's actually way more diversity to overcome and a lot more to manage.
Yeah.
In the Chinese Heritage Church world on the East Coast, there was kind of a little trend for a while, only 2 languages. So basically, if you're Mandarin, Cantonese, and English, one of the trends was, okay, we've got to keep the local language English, and then there's Cantonese or Mandarin.
Pick one.
We're going to pick one, and we're going to launch them out because
right.
2 is a lot easier than 1. There's challenges with that as well, like
Right.
sustainability of those churches and
Right.
families and stuff like that. But yeah, it's funny. And in terms of the majority church, it's always come to our majority white churches. I mean, and that's not meant in any, there's no hubris. It's genuine good intention. But I mean, if you really want a diverse majority culture, go to one of our churches where you have to sit through interpretation and makes the sermon twice as long, but not necessarily twice as good. Okay, so so I think we are past a point culturally where it's not enough to just hire that one black guy or the one Asian guy on staff.
Yeah.
That was a huge trend for a while. And that's still value added and that's still helpful, but there's a difference between a church that has multiple ethnicities worshiping in there or even on this team, leadership, versus that church is actively expending energy and grace to be a living multi-ethnic experience in terms of their culture. So sorry for my rant, but that I feel like a lot of Asian American leaders probably being a little hard on themselves. And maybe we can be encouraged by the incredible amount of diversity that they are navigating with God's grace.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for sharing all that. And you're totally right. There's so much more than meets the eye. So what's the final word that we can give to many who will be watching this to encourage them in faithfulness, but then also in pursuing a diversity that's reflective of how we're made as image bearers and how God sees us rather than maybe what we see ourselves?
Well, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, and that's a great question. I'm still in process, but for me, I think it's trying to be in those spaces and expanding people's biblical concept of diversity. In the secular world, my Chinese American or Asian American socialist activists, like in Chinatown, I have a lot of friends that are proud Marxists, proud activists and stuff. And so this point I'm about to make is pretty common in that Asian American studies world, but probably not quite in the evangelical world. I was on a panel once up in New England for a New England regional gathering with other leaders, and the topic was race relations. And we did the panel, we're there for an hour, and then we're wrapping up. Any final thoughts? And the moderator said, Enoch, do you have any final thoughts? And I thought, well, this has been a really good discussion. I've learned a lot, and I think it's been helpful. But I guess my thought is, I don't think we've been talking about race relations. And the group looked at me like I was, like, I don't know, grew another arm or something. Like, are you kidding me? What do you think we've been talking about? Oh, I don't think we've been talking about race relations. I think we've been talking about black and white relations, which is an important topic. But that binary is, as important as it is not really the full orb discussion of race. And I said, we haven't mentioned anything relevant to Asians, Latinos, Latinos and stuff, and or brown, and it's just or First Nation. So it's just, and then, I don't like to incite or throw monkey wrenches around, but I thought maybe that was part of that. So I guess part of a closing thought is just, I think I find it helpful and constructive, just if God allows, to expand each other's thinking. Because to say, you need to be more diverse, I don't find it helpful to argue or push back, or I go, what do you mean?
Yeah.
And then I go, oh, so you mean more ethnically diverse? Like which church? That church. Oh, okay, that's true. But have you noticed that they're mostly the same age, and they're mostly the same class, and they all like the same Hillsong elevation worship. It's just, so that would be my sort of thinking about, like, I'm not on a mission to defend the immigrant or Asian American church as an apologetic, although I think that is an important topic. I just find these one-on-one or little spaces of conversations to go. Diversity, anthropologists have a term about culture, and they sometimes make this observation about people from monocultural settings. Culture is thicker than most people realize.
Yeah.
So that Caucasian brother or sister that becomes the youth minister in one of our Asian American churches, think they're basically white or American because they speak English, they do everything. And they go visit their house and wait, I have to take my shoes off?
Yeah.
Like, what's this cabbage thing that has red stuff on it? It's a totally different world. And our phrase is code switching. They're bilingual, they're bicultural, and they might be able to switch between their parents' tongue and English very quickly. But I think a lot of Asian Americans who are growing up as the children, the first generation born here, they're also bicultural. They can switch cultural codes very readily. And that's an advantage and an asset in this global world. And that's a lot of our missionary partners tell us that's super helpful to take someone who's already had multicultural, cross-cultural, bicultural experience and then go to another place. We were in Philippines in a pretty remote part. And our host missionary said, here, you don't have to do this, but they're going to put food in front of you and you don't have to eat it. And we talked to our missionary, because she's made those comments a few times, like, well, why would you say that? And basically, they were majority culture from Western Anglo missionaries that had come. And I get it, I'm not criticizing that, but they didn't eat the stuff that they put in front of them.
Right.
They were trying to be gracious and said, oh, no, we'll provide for ourselves. But a lot of those times, it's like this usually impoverished people group sacrificed to give you their food that they're very grateful and proud of.
Yeah.
And so me and my pastor and I, we just ate it. And the lady is like, whoa, I've never seen a visiting, foreigner from America eat their food.
Yeah.
You guys are really cross-cultural workers trained. I said, no. We're just Chinese. We eat a lot of stuff. But that's an advantage. And I don't mean to follow into a stereotype of Chinese people eating stuff, but it's just kind of our makeup as immigrant children, Asian Americans. And I guess that's the spirit of just trying to be encouraging and learning from each other. So those are kind of my thoughts. I don't know if you have any thoughts as well. I'd love to hear your thinking about any sort of encouraging or final thoughts about this whole topic.
Yeah, my final thought is just a lot of times the reason why we wrestle with this, especially in our context, is because we have to persevere through a lot. And maybe for some of us, we've suffered through a lot because of the generational differences and the cultural hierarchy and so on and so forth. So then it's easy to just say, you know what, I wish we were more diverse. I wish we looked differently. But really, in all these ways in which God is using these circumstances and these relationships, it's actually teaching us what it looks like to build bridges, to cross barriers, and to win people to Christ, and to be able to share it and contextualize the gospel in a way that's winsome and that's filled with love and the fruit of the Spirit. And so your church might look a certain way, your church may not look a certain way, but at the end of the day, the diversity that we're pursuing is one that reflects the goodness and the beauty of God. And so there's always a way by which we can grow, and also how we can invest in our own families, in our own church family, to continue just to be faithful and not be discouraged by what only man sees when we know that the Lord sees the heart.
And he does see our diversity, and by his grace, he's celebrating it, and we'll learn to celebrate it more when we see him face to face. Awesome. Thanks, man. Great talking with you, Terrence.
Yeah, same.